The true architects of ancient power were not the kings on their thrones. They were the forgotten philosophers writing in quiet libraries. While emperors commanded armies, these thinkers were drafting the very rule books of governance. Their ideas on law, administration, and justice provided the intellectual framework that turned raw force into lasting authority. By the end of this journey, you will understand how a simple scroll could shape the fate of empires. We will uncover why history erased these master strategists and how their hidden blueprints for power still operate in our world today. What does it truly take to build a civilization that lasts for centuries? A king's power, freshly won on the battlefield, was often a chaotic and temporary thing. It required a new kind of alchemy to become permanent, a transformation performed not in a forge but in a study. The philosopher in the royal court held the key. That scroll he presented was more valuable than any tribute of gold, for it contained the operating system for an empire. These thinkers understood that to command obedience, a ruler needed more than fear. They needed legitimacy, a sense that their authority was right, orderly, and even natural. This is where the first great school of thought made its indelible mark. The Stoics, for instance, taught that a universal reason, a divine logic they called the Logos, governed all of existence. A wise king, they argued, was not merely a strongman. He was an agent of this cosmic order, aligning his laws with the rational principles of the universe itself. This was a brilliant ideological move. It framed the king's commands not as arbitrary whims, but as expressions of a higher, rational truth. His decrees became as inevitable and just as the changing of the seasons. Can you see the sheer power of this idea? It gave subjects a philosophical reason to obey, a moral framework that made submission feel like participation in a grand cosmic plan. But another school, the Cynics, took a radically different approach. They questioned the very foundations of power, arguing that true freedom came from rejecting social conventions and material wealth. So why would a ruler ever listen to such a critic? Precisely because their harsh, uncompromising voice served as a vital check. By tolerating and even sponsoring these philosophical dissenters, a king could demonstrate his confidence and wisdom. It showed he was not a tyrant afraid of criticism, but a sovereign secure enough to engage with challenging ideas. This patronage subtly bolstered his image as a thoughtful and legitimate leader. The alliance was a delicate dance. The sovereign provided the platform and the protection, while the philosopher provided the intellectual scaffolding that turned a throne of conquest into a throne of law. This was the hidden machinery of ancient power, and its gears were turning long before the rise of Rome. This philosophical dance between power and ideas found its most enduring expression far to the east. In the fractious chaos of China's warring states period, where rival kingdoms clashed in endless cycles of violence, a single teacher proposed a revolutionary source of authority. His name was Confucius, and his blueprint for power rejected brute force entirely. He argued that a ruler's true right to govern, what he called the mandate of heaven, was not a divine right to command, but a sacred responsibility to act with virtue. This mandate could be earned, and just as critically, it could be lost. A king who ruled with greed, cruelty, or incompetence would inevitably forfeit this heavenly approval, leading to rebellion and collapse. The stability of the entire state, therefore, rested not on the sharpness of its swords, but on the moral character of its leader. This was a profound inversion of conventional thinking. Power was not something you took and held by force. It was something you cultivated and maintained through exemplary conduct. Confucius detailed the virtues required for this task, a code of ethics that emphasized righteousness, benevolence, and a deep respect for ritual and tradition. He stressed the importance of filial piety, the respect for one's parents and ancestors, because he saw the family as the fundamental model for the state. A well-ordered household, with each member understanding their role and responsibilities, was a miniature version of a well-ordered kingdom. The ruler was the father of the nation, and his primary duty was to care for his people with the same benevolence a good father shows his children. His power flowed downward, not from the threat of punishment, but from the magnetic pull of his moral example. When a king acted with integrity and compassion, he inspired his officials to do the same, and they in turn guided the common people toward harmony. This created a self-reinforcing system of stability. It was a philosophy that offered a clear path out of the perpetual warfare, promising a society built on mutual obligation rather than mutual fear. Long after his death, Confucius's disciples compiled and systematized his teachings into a comprehensive guide for emperors. This body of thought became the very backbone of Chinese imperial administration, the unofficial operating system for one of history's most durable civilizations. For 2,000 years, emperors were examined on their knowledge of the Confucian classics, and bureaucrats were selected through civil service tests based on its principles. Here, a philosophical framework did not just advise power, it became the absolute bedrock of political legitimacy itself. But while Confucius built a system of power on moral virtue, a philosopher in ancient Greece proposed an even more radical fusion. Plato's answer to the problem of power was breathtaking in its simplicity and its ambition. He declared that the only person fit to rule a state was a philosopher who had grasped the ultimate nature of truth and justice. After witnessing the execution of his teacher, Socrates, by the Athenian democracy, Plato became deeply suspicious of popular rule. He saw how easily a crowd could be swayed by emotion and rhetoric, leading to disastrous decisions. His solution, laid out in his monumental work The Republic, was to remove governance from the hands of the many and place it in the hands of the one truly qualified individual, the philosopher king. This was not a hereditary monarch or a victorious general. This was a ruler who had spent a lifetime in rigorous intellectual training. Plato envisioned a decades-long education system, starting in youth, focused on mathematics, logic, and finally, dialectic, the art of philosophical debate. The goal was to lead the future ruler's mind away from the ever-changing shadows of the physical world and toward the understanding of perfect, unchanging ideals, what Plato called the forms. The most important of these was the form of the good, the ultimate source of all truth, beauty, and justice. A leader who had directly contemplated this perfect good, Plato argued, would be incapable of ruling selfishly or unjustly. Their every decision would be an expression of pure wisdom, just as a navigator who understands the stars will steer the ship correctly. Can you grasp the profound difference this idea creates? Power is no longer about lineage or strength, but about enlightenment. The authority of the philosopher king does not come from divine mandate or popular vote, but from objective knowledge. They rule because they alone know what is truly best for the state. Of course, this ideal was never fully realized in the ancient world. Plato himself failed in his attempts to tutor a real-life tyrant of Syracuse into becoming such a ruler. Yet the power of the idea was immense. It introduced the lasting notion that governing is a specialized skill, an art that requires deep, specialized knowledge. It suggested that the most dangerous leader is not the most cruel, but the most ignorant, the one who rules without any understanding of justice. This concept of the wise, detached ruler governing for the true good of the people rather than for personal glory, would become a powerful ghost in the machine of Western political thought. It was a dream of power purified by wisdom, a dream that would tempt and challenge empires long after Athens fell. Plato's dream of a perfect ruler guided by pure reason was a majestic vision, but it was his own student who would bring political philosophy down to earth. Aristotle looked at the same world of cities and power and asked a different, more practical question. Instead of asking what the ideal state should be, he asked a far more urgent one: how do real states actually survive? To find the answer, he embarked on an unprecedented project, gathering and studying the constitutions of over 150 Greek city-states. This was not abstract theorizing, it was the birth of political science as a practical discipline, an attempt to understand power by examining its real-world results. His great work, Politics, is a masterpiece of empirical observation. He classified governments into different types, like rule by one, by a few, or by many, and then he identified what made each version healthy or corrupt. A monarchy could decay into a tyranny, an aristocracy into an oligarchy, and a democracy into mob rule. The key to stability, Aristotle concluded, was not to find a perfect philosopher king, but to prevent any single group from dominating the others. His brilliant solution was the idea of a mixed constitution, which he called a polity. This system deliberately blended elements from different forms of government. Imagine a state with a single leader for decisive action, a small council of experienced elders for wisdom, and an assembly of citizens to represent the broader public interest. By balancing these powers, no one faction could easily seize control, but Aristotle went even deeper. He understood that political instability usually springs from economic discontent. If the poor majority feels oppressed and hungry, revolution is inevitable. If the wealthy minority feels their property is threatened, they will conspire to overthrow the government. Therefore, the most practical thing a ruler could do to maintain power was to ensure a large, stable middle class. A thriving middle class, he argued, acts as a buffer and a balancing force. They are not so desperate as to crave radical change, nor so wealthy as to become arrogant. They value stability, law, and order above all else. This was a revolutionary focus on the material foundations of power. A stable state required not just good laws, but a prosperous and reasonably equitable economy. Aristotle's advice to rulers was profoundly pragmatic: foster commerce, avoid extreme poverty, and most importantly, govern with moderation. His entire philosophy was a rejection of ideological purity in favor of what works. He provided leaders with a functional toolkit for endurance, a blueprint for building a state resilient enough to withstand the inevitable pressures of human nature. Where Plato gave us a star to steer by, Aristotle gave us the first detailed map of the political landscape, a map drawn from the messy, complicated reality of how people actually live and govern themselves. Aristotle's pragmatic focus on stability would face its ultimate test in the sprawling, chaotic empire that followed Alexander the Great's death. From that fragmentation rose a philosophy tailor-made for governing a complex world, Stoicism. Its most powerful advocates were not just teachers but men at the very heart of power. Seneca, the brilliant playwright and senator, found himself as the reluctant tutor to the young Emperor Nero. He tried to instill in his volatile student the core Stoic belief that a ruler's primary duty was to reason and the common good. A leader, Seneca argued, must see himself as a servant of a universal order, the logos, and his own emotions were the greatest threat to stable rule. Governing was not about indulging whims or seeking glory, but about exercising unwavering self-control and a deep sense of responsibility. This was a philosophy for the trenches of power, a guide for making just decisions when surrounded by corruption and fear. The ultimate embodiment of this ideal, however, was the emperor who carried a philosopher's notebook into battle. Marcus Aurelius, ruling at the height of Rome's power, never wanted to be emperor. He would have preferred a life of quiet study, yet he accepted the throne as his stoic duty. While leading military campaigns along the Danube frontier, he composed his private thoughts, now known as his Meditations. In those pages, he constantly reminded himself to rise above the pettiness of court politics, the lure of flattery, and the exhaustion of command. He wrote of enduring hardship without complaint, of treating even his enemies with fairness, and of focusing only on actions that served the public welfare. Here was a man with absolute power, consciously using philosophy as a moral compass to navigate the immense temptations and burdens of his office. Stoicism provided the Roman world with something invaluable, a code of conduct that encouraged resilience, justice, and administrative competence. It was the operating system for a conscience, a way to prevent power from corrupting absolutely. By urging leaders to look inward and master themselves before attempting to master the world, these forgotten philosophers offered a recipe for rule that was not only effective but, in its own way, noble. Yet this noble ideal of a ruler guided by conscience was not the only philosophy vying for an emperor's ear. In the very same era as Confucius, a radically different and far darker school of thought emerged in China. Legalism dismissed the idea of virtuous leadership as a dangerous fantasy. Its most famous proponent, Han Fei, argued that human nature is fundamentally selfish and driven by base desires. Trusting a ruler's moral character was a recipe for chaos. Instead, legalism proposed a system of power built not on trust, but on absolute, predictable control. The entire state should function like a perfectly calibrated machine with the ruler as its sole operator. This required two key instruments. The first was a comprehensive set of laws or fa. These laws were to be made public, clear, and applied with uniform harshness, regardless of a person's status. The second instrument was statecraft or shu, a set of administrative techniques designed to keep everyone, especially powerful officials, in a state of perpetual uncertainty and obedience. The ruler maintained his power, or she, by mastering these arts of control. He would set officials against one another, creating a system of mutual surveillance where no one felt secure enough to plot against the throne. Rewards were to be given sparingly, but punishments were to be severe and automatic. The philosophy was brutally simple. Fear of punishment was a far more reliable tool for maintaining order than the hope for moral example. This grim world found its ultimate patron in Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor to unify China. He adopted legalism as his official doctrine, using its principles to standardize everything from writing and currency to the axles on carts. His regime was ruthlessly efficient, crushing feudal opposition and centralizing power with an iron grip. The Great Wall itself stands as a monumental testament to this philosophy, a project built through conscripted labor under the threat of death. For a short time, legalism worked with terrifying effectiveness, forging a scattered collection of warring states into a single, powerful empire. But its success contained the seeds of its own destruction. The unrelenting brutality of the Qin dynasty sparked widespread rebellion almost immediately after the first emperor's death. The system was so oppressive that it could not endure. Legalism demonstrated a profound and unsettling truth. A philosophy of pure control could indeed build an empire with breathtaking speed, but it could not create the loyalty or cultural cohesion needed to sustain one. It was power stripped of all pretense, a cold, hard blueprint for domination that still serves as a stark warning about the limits of fear. But what happens when the philosopher king is gone? A brilliant ruler, guided by Stoic virtue or Confucian benevolence, could inspire an empire, but their wisdom died with them. The great innovation, the one that truly allowed civilizations to endure for centuries, came not from the throne room but from the scriptorium. It was the work of countless anonymous clerks and administrators, the unsung engineers of power who translated grand philosophies into dry, meticulous procedure. Their legacy was not a famous treatise but a tax ledger, a land survey, a standardized legal form. These seemingly boring documents were the true scaffolding of empire, the systems that made governance possible on a scale never before imagined. Think of an empire not as a single powerful will, but as a vast, complex organism. How does a command from the capital reach a distant province? How are thousands of soldiers fed and paid? How is wealth collected from millions of subjects and redistributed to fund roads, aqueducts, and armies? The answer always lay in a system, a repeatable, teachable process that could be executed by mid-level officials who would never meet the emperor. These anonymous bureaucrats were the system architects. They wrote the manuals on how to conduct a census, creating the first detailed maps of a state's greatest resource, its people. They designed the protocols for tax collection, turning agricultural harvests into a predictable stream of state revenue. They developed the formulas for logistics, calculating the precise amount of grain needed to supply a legion on a 6-month campaign. This was philosophy made operational. The Confucian principle of order became a filing system. The legalist demand for control became a uniform penal code. The Stoic virtue of duty became a strict hierarchy of administrative responsibility. The power of this systemization was its ability to outlive individuals. A dynasty could fall, a weak emperor could squander his inheritance, but the bureaucracy often endured. The system had its own momentum, its own logic. New rulers, even conquerors from a different culture, frequently discovered that to govern their new territories, they had no choice but to adopt the existing administrative machinery. They needed the scribes who knew where the records were kept and how to interpret them. This gave the anonymous bureaucrat a quiet, profound form of influence. By encoding philosophical principles into the daily habits of government, they ensured that those ideas would shape the exercise of power long after the original philosophers were forgotten. The true throne of an empire was not a golden chair, but a well-organized archive where every scroll represented a single gear in a machine so vast and resilient it could withstand the rise and fall of kings. This quiet machinery of bureaucracy required a central processing unit, a place where knowledge could be gathered, sorted, and weaponized. That place was the great library, and in the ancient world, it was as crucial to power as any fortress or treasury. The legendary Library of Alexandria was the ultimate expression of this idea. It was not a quiet, scholarly retreat, but a vibrant think tank funded directly by the Ptolemaic kings of Egypt. These rulers understood that attracting the greatest minds of the age was a strategic investment. They offered lavish salaries, free room and board, and unparalleled access to the known world's accumulated knowledge. In return, these philosophers, poets, and scientists produced works that served the kingdom's interests. They drafted legal codes that centralized authority, wrote histories that glorified the ruling dynasty, and conducted research that improved agriculture, engineering, and medicine, directly strengthening the state. The library was a factory for legitimacy. By amassing every scroll they could acquire, often by confiscating them from ships in the harbor, the Ptolemies were not just hoarding information, they were centralizing intellectual authority. They were building the definitive archive, the one place on Earth where the true story of the world, its laws, and its peoples could be found. This was a powerful statement of cultural supremacy. A rival kingdom like Pergamum responded by building its own magnificent library, turning the accumulation of knowledge into a high-stakes geopolitical competition. Controlling the scrolls meant controlling the narrative. The history of a rival could be rewritten, scientific discoveries that threatened religious orthodoxy could be suppressed, and legal precedents that challenged the king's authority could be conveniently lost. The library was the ultimate instrument of soft power, projecting an image of enlightened leadership while quietly consolidating control over the very ideas that shaped society. It was proof that the pen, when supported by a vast, organized collection of other pens, could indeed be mightier than the sword. Yet these systems of thought were never meant to be confined by borders. The great libraries and bureaucracies became hubs in a vast, invisible network where the rules of power were constantly being translated, both in language and in concept. Philosophical ideas proved to be highly portable goods, traveling alongside silk and spices on the caravan routes that connected the world. A Greek text on statecraft, preserved in some dusty archive, might find itself copied and carried eastward, its concept slowly seeping into the political thought of an Indian kingdom. The journey of Buddhist philosophy from India into China is a perfect example of this transformative adaptation. When Buddhist monks first arrived, their teachings on detachment and inner peace seemed at odds with the family-centered, socially engaged ideals of Confucianism. To gain a foothold, the philosophers acting as cultural translators had to perform a delicate operation. They began to reinterpret Buddhist texts using familiar Confucian and Taoist terms, framing concepts like karma and enlightenment in a way that resonated with Chinese values. This was not a simple act of copying. It was a creative synthesis, a hybridization that produced something entirely new, a uniquely Chinese form of Buddhism that would go on to profoundly influence emperors and dynasties for centuries. Similarly, when the Islamic caliphates expanded, they did not simply erase the empires they conquered. They recognized the sophisticated administrative machinery of the former Persian Sasanian Empire and saw its immense utility. Persian bureaucratic techniques, models for tax collection, and systems of provincial governance were carefully studied, translated into Arabic, and integrated into the caliphate's own ruling structure. The rulers in Baghdad understood that the most effective ideas for maintaining power were often those already tested by time, regardless of their origin. This cross-pollination reveals a crucial truth. The so-called rules of ancient power were frequently a collaborative, international project. A ruler seeking to consolidate authority had a global toolkit at their disposal, assembled by generations of philosophers who served as these vital cultural bridges. They were the diplomats of ideas, taking a foreign concept and skillfully reworking its edges until it fit seamlessly into a new cultural puzzle, giving their patrons a distinct and powerful advantage. This translation of ideas required a parallel translation of identity. The most potent tool a philosopher could offer a ruler was not just a system of laws, but an entire story about the universe, one in which the king played an essential, divinely ordained role. Across the ancient world, from the banks of the Nile to the plains of China, thinkers became master myth-makers, weaving cosmological narratives that transformed a mere mortal into a pillar of cosmic order. This was the ultimate act of political branding, creating a source of legitimacy that was, in theory, unassailable. How do you convince millions of people to obey one man? You convince them that his authority is as natural and inevitable as the sunrise. In Egypt, the pharaoh was not merely a ruler, he was the living incarnation of the god Horus, the divine falcon, and the son of the sun god Ra. His every action, from leading armies to overseeing the harvest, was framed as part of a celestial drama. The pyramids themselves were not just tombs, They were colossal machines designed to launch the pharaoh's soul back to the stars, reinforcing his eternal connection to the divine. This narrative was meticulously crafted and maintained by a powerful class of priest philosophers. They were the keepers of the calendar, the interpreters of dreams, and the authors of the spells that guided the king in the afterlife. Their intellectual work provided the theological foundation that made the pharaoh's power feel absolute and timeless. To rebel against the pharaoh was not just a political crime, it was a sin against the gods, an act that threatened to plunge the entire world back into the chaos that existed before creation. This was a psychological masterstroke. It embedded obedience deep within the cultural and spiritual identity of every subject. A similar, though distinct, concept operated in China with the mandate of heaven. While it emphasized virtue over direct divinity, it still placed the emperor at the very center of a cosmic feedback loop. Natural disasters like floods or famines were not random tragedies. They were interpreted as signs from heaven that the emperor had lost his moral way. The philosopher scholars who advised the court were the official interpreters of these celestial signals. Their role was to read the signs and counsel the emperor on how to correct his conduct to regain heaven's favor. This created a powerful narrative of accountability, but one that still revolved entirely around the emperor's pivotal role in maintaining the balance between heaven and earth. Even in the more rationalistic Roman world, emperors understood the power of a grand narrative. Augustus, the first emperor, did not claim to be a god during his lifetime, but he launched a massive propaganda campaign that linked his rule to a new golden age of peace and prosperity, the Pax Romana. Poets like Virgil were effectively court philosophers, composing epic poems like the Aeneid that traced the origins of Rome back to the Trojan hero Aeneas, son of the goddess Venus. This gave the Roman state, and by extension Augustus' rule, a legendary preordained destiny. The philosopher's scroll in this context was a reality generation device. By authoring the official history, the state religion, and the cultural myths, these thinkers could construct a shared reality where the ruler's power was not just accepted, but seen as a fundamental, necessary part of the world. Challenging the king meant challenging the universe itself, a thought so daunting it prevented rebellion before it could even begin. But these grand mythologies and administrative systems all rested on a far more tangible foundation, one that required its own school of philosophical thought. The most brilliant legal code or divine narrative was useless if the state's treasury lay empty. A handful of pragmatic thinkers turned their attention away from the stars and toward the ledger books, understanding that real power was measured in grain, metal, and coin. They became the first economic philosophers, and their advice was often the difference between an empire's golden age and its collapse into dust. In ancient Greece, the historian and soldier Xenophon, a student of Socrates, produced a work that reads like a modern policy brief. His essay, Ways and Means, was a direct proposal to the Athenian state on how to solve a perpetual budget crisis. He moved beyond simple plunder or raising taxes, suggesting instead a sophisticated program of state-sponsored entrepreneurship. He proposed that Athens invest in building inns and shops for foreign merchants, and even purchase a large fleet of slaves to lease out to silver mine operators. The revenue from these public investments, he argued, would create a permanent, reliable income stream, freeing the city from its dependence on volatile war spoils and unpopular levies on its citizens. This was a revolutionary concept, envisioning the state not just as a tax collector, but as an economic engine in its own right. The ultimate ancient manual on economic statecraft, however, was compiled far to the east. The Arthashastra, attributed to the cunning philosopher Kautilya, is a breathtakingly comprehensive guide to running a kingdom. It dedicates enormous attention to the management of the treasury, which it calls the root of all state activity. Cortelia's approach was ruthlessly systematic. He detailed exactly how much of a farmer's harvest should be taken as tax, how to assess the value of goods for customs duties, and even how to set up state-controlled monopolies on essential commodities like salt, minerals, and alcohol. He understood that economic power was about control over resources and information. His text advises the king to employ a network of spies to monitor market prices and prevent profiteering, and to create strategic grain reserves to stabilize prices during a famine. For Cortelia, wealth was not the king's personal hoard to be spent on luxuries. It was the fuel for every function of the state, from paying soldiers and officials to funding irrigation projects that increased agricultural output. A full treasury meant a strong army and content subjects. An empty one invited invasion and revolt. These early economists grasped a fundamental truth that still resonates today. Political stability is impossible without economic stability. A ruler might command absolute loyalty through fear or faith, but that loyalty will evaporate the moment people cannot feed their families. By providing the intellectual frameworks for sound public finance, these forgotten philosophers gave rulers the tools to build lasting power from the ground up, turning the mundane flow of commerce into the steady heartbeat of an empire. Yet this economic and administrative machinery remained inert without a voice to command it. The final, and perhaps most personal, instrument of power was the human voice itself, skillfully wielded in the public square. In the bustling assemblies of Athens and the solemn Senate of Rome, the ability to persuade was not just an art, it was a direct form of authority. A new class of philosopher emerged to teach this craft, the rhetorician. Men like Isocrates in Greece and Cicero in Rome argued that eloquent speech was the very lifeblood of effective governance. They composed detailed manuals, breaking down the art of persuasion into a teachable science. A successful leader, they taught, must master three core appeals: logos, the logical structure of an argument, built on evidence and reason; pathos, the ability to connect with the audience's emotions, stirring their hopes or calming their fears; and ethos, the speaker's own credibility and moral character, which had to be carefully cultivated over time. For a ruler, this was a toolkit of immense strategic value. Imagine a king needing to raise taxes for a new defensive wall. He could simply issue a decree provoking resentment, or, armed with rhetoric, he could frame the request as a shared sacrifice for the common safety, appealing to the citizens' pride and their fear of invasion. He could use logical examples of past invasions, stir patriotic emotion with tales of their ancestors' bravery, and present himself as a prudent guardian of the public trust. This was power exercised through consensus rather than coercion. Cicero, who rose from a middle-class background to become Rome's leading statesman through sheer oratorical skill, demonstrated this principle perfectly. His famous speeches against the conspirator Catiline were not just accusations, they were masterpieces of political theater that isolated his enemy and rallied the entire Senate to his cause. He used words as his army, achieving what might have required civil war. Rhetoric was the essential skill for navigating the complex political currents of a republic, allowing a leader to build fragile alliances and justify difficult decisions. It transformed raw power into legitimate authority by making the case for it in the court of public opinion. The study of persuasion became a critical discipline of statecraft because it recognized a fundamental truth: an empire might be built on laws and logistics, but it is ultimately held together by the stories its leaders tell and the consent those stories generate. Yet even the most persuasive voice capable of building empires through words could pose a dangerous question: what if this power is unjust? The very philosophers who drafted the rule books for rulers also served as their most persistent conscience. drawing an ethical line that power was not meant to cross. Their primary concern was not the effectiveness of a law, but its justice. They engaged in fierce debates over the morality of warfare, asking whether any cause truly justified the slaughter it entailed. They questioned the fairness of tax systems, arguing that burdening the poor while the rich grew wealthier was a recipe for societal decay. Above all, they returned to a central theme: the ruler's fundamental duty to their subjects. This was not merely about maintaining order, it was about fostering a good and virtuous life for the people under their care. The most iconic figure in this tradition is Socrates, the gadfly of Athens. He made it his life's work to confront the city's most powerful citizens, not with weapons but with relentless, logical questioning. He would corner generals and politicians in the public square, asking them to define terms like courage, justice, and piety. His goal was to expose the gap between their confident exercise of power and their actual understanding of the moral foundations that should support it. He argued that a leader who cannot define justice is incapable of acting justly, making them a danger to the state they claim to serve. This was a radical and deeply threatening idea. It suggested that authority was not self-justifying, that it had to be earned through intellectual and moral rigor. For this challenge to the establishment, Socrates was ultimately put on trial and sentenced to death. His final act, drinking the hemlock poison, became the ultimate testament to the principle that a philosopher must remain true to their conscience, even in the face of absolute power. By insisting that rule must be tempered by wisdom and virtue, these thinkers planted the essential seeds for limiting sovereign authority. They introduced the revolutionary notion that a ruler is accountable to a higher standard than their own will, a standard based on reason and ethical conduct. This philosophical struggle, this constant tension between the raw exercise of power and the moral demands of justice, would echo through the centuries. It laid the groundwork for future concepts like the rule of law, where even the king is not above it, and for the social contract, which bases a government's legitimacy on the consent of the governed. The Philosopher's Scroll, therefore, was not just a manual for command, but also a mirror held up to power, reflecting its potential for both greatness and corruption. But this public philosophy of virtue and justice had a shadow curriculum. For every scroll of law or moral treatise presented to the people, there was often another, far more secret document, written for the ruler's eyes only. This was the world of Arcana Imperii, the secrets of power, a collection of esoteric advice that drew on the darkest insights of human psychology and strategy. These texts were not about building a just society, they were about preserving a ruler's grip on it by any means necessary. The Chinese strategist Sun Tzu's The Art of War, while famous for its military maxims, was also a deep study in deception and psychological manipulation. His famous dictum that all warfare is based on deception applied just as well to the palace intrigues and diplomatic maneuvers of court life. A ruler had to know how to appear weak when he was strong, and how to feign friendship to a rival he intended to destroy. This was not cynical advice for its own sake. It was a coldly rational approach to survival in a world where a single misstep could mean assassination or revolt. In India, the Arthashastra went even further, dedicating entire chapters to the arts of espionage, assassination, and covert operations. Kautilya advised the king to maintain a vast network of spies, not just in enemy territories, but within his own court and among his own family. He detailed how to use agents as poisoners, how to spread disinformation to destabilize a rival kingdom, and how to secretly test the loyalty of his own ministers by planting false information. This secret council was a philosophical acknowledgement of a grim reality. that the idealized virtues preached to the public were often a luxury a ruler could not afford in the brutal game of maintaining control. The public face of power might be benevolent and lawful, but its private support system required a ruthless understanding of human ambition and fear. This hidden intellectual framework was the ultimate insurance policy for a throne, a reminder that while philosophy could build the stage for power, it also had to provide the tools for surviving the performance. This transformation from philosophical principle to concrete law represents the ultimate test of a political idea. An elegant theory about justice means very little if it cannot be written into a statute that governs the lives of millions. The true architects of this bridge were not always famous philosophers, but often anonymous jurists, the legal scholars who dedicated their lives to translating high-minded ideals into the precise language of legal code. Their work turned abstract concepts like equity and natural rights into the daily machinery of the courts. Nowhere is this process more visible than in the monumental achievement of Roman law. For centuries, Roman jurists engaged in a sprawling intellectual project, debating and refining the principles that should underpin a vast multicultural empire. They asked profound questions. What does it mean for a law to be fair? How should a legal system treat a foreigner differently from a citizen? Their answers were not just academic exercises, they were written into the edicts of praetors and the opinions that guided judges. This immense body of legal thought was eventually compiled under the Byzantine Emperor Justinian into a single, colossal work known as the Digest. The Digest is not a simple list of laws, it is a 500,000-word tapestry of philosophical reasoning, a collection of the most brilliant legal opinions from Rome's greatest minds. It systematically organized centuries of jurisprudence, creating a coherent legal framework that could be taught, learned, and applied across an empire. This was philosophy made operational on a grand scale. The principles of Stoicism, for instance, with its belief in a universal reason governing all people, found direct expression in the Roman concept of the law of nations. This was a set of legal principles thought to be common to all humanity, regardless of their specific citizenship. It governed dealings between Romans and foreigners, emphasizing fairness and good faith. By codifying this idea, the jurists gave judges a tool to resolve disputes in a diverse empire, building a system that could accommodate different cultures under a single, rational rule of law. This process of codification did more than just create order. It actively defined the relationship between the individual and the state. For the first time, the rights and obligations of a citizen were written down in a systematic way. The law code set boundaries, limiting what the state could arbitrarily take from a person, while also clarifying the duties like military service or tax payment that were required for the state to function. The legal code became the physical embodiment of the social contract, a tangible set of rules that everyone, in theory, was expected to follow. The enduring power of this work is almost impossible to overstate. The Digest of Justinian became the foundational text for nearly all Western legal systems. It influenced the Napoleonic Code, which in turn shaped laws across Europe and Latin America. Its principles echo in the common law traditions of the English-speaking world. When a modern court debates the intent behind a law or the principles of natural justice, it is participating in a conversation started by those Roman jurists 2,000 years ago. They proved that the most durable throne is not made of gold or marble, but of parchment inscribed with laws that aspire to be both wise and just. A shared ideology, however, required a dedicated transmission line to flow from one generation to the next. The ultimate safeguard for any system of power was its ability to replicate itself, to produce new rulers who thought and acted according to the established philosophical blueprint. This was the profound purpose behind the elite education of the ancient world. A young prince or a son of a noble family did not simply inherit a title. He was enrolled in a rigorous program designed to shape his very mind. His tutors were not mere babysitters. They were often the most prominent philosophers of the age, tasked with molding the character and intellect of future power. In Athens, Plato's academy was not an ivory tower for abstract debate. It was a training ground for statesmen. Young men from influential families studied there to absorb the principles of justice, logic, and the ideal forms of governance that Plato had outlined. They engaged in relentless dialectical argument, learning to dissect ideas and defend their positions with reason. The goal was to create a ruling class united by a common intellectual language and a shared commitment to philosophical virtue. This was considered the essential preparation for leadership, far more important than military drills alone. Across the world, in the courts of China, a similar process unfolded on a massive scale. Aspiring mandarins, the future administrators of the empire, spent years, sometimes decades, memorizing and interpreting the Confucian classics. Their entire education was a deep immersion in the values of benevolence, righteousness, and filial piety. They practiced calligraphy not just as an art, but as a discipline of patience and precision. They composed poetry and essays that demonstrated their grasp of statecraft and moral philosophy. The entire system culminated in the infamous Imperial examinations, a series of grueling tests that determined a candidate's fitness for office. Success in these exams did not just require rote memorization, it demanded a profound internalization of the Confucian worldview. The system ensured that every official who entered the bureaucracy, from the lowest county magistrate to the highest minister, operated from the same foundational playbook. They shared a common framework for solving problems, assessing justice, and understanding their duty to the emperor and the people. This created an incredible continuity of ideology and administrative practice. Even when a dynasty fell and a new family took the throne, the machinery of government, staffed by these classically educated officials, continued to function largely unchanged. The philosophical training of the elite was the ultimate inheritance strategy, more durable than any will or treaty. It guaranteed that the rules of power, carefully drafted by forgotten thinkers, would outlive the individuals who first wielded them, governing the minds of rulers for centuries to come. But for every philosopher who drafted a king's laws, there was another who saw the throne itself as the problem. While court scholars penned justifications for authority, a man named Diogenes was living in a clay tub on the streets of Athens, embodying a radical rejection of the entire system. He owned nothing, followed no conventions, and when the most powerful man in the world, Alexander the Great, stood before him and offered to grant any wish, Diogenes simply replied, "Stop blocking my son." This was not mere rudeness, it was a philosophical statement. Diogenes, the most famous cynic, argued that true freedom lay in shedding the artificial desires and hollow honors that society valued, including the pursuit of power. By living in poverty by choice and mocking the powerful with biting wit, he demonstrated that a meaningful life was possible entirely outside the established hierarchies. His actions posed a dangerous question. If a man with nothing can be truly happy and free, then what real authority does a king actually hold over him? The cynics created a powerful counter-narrative. They argued that social conventions, from money to political office, were not natural or divine, but merely human inventions, fragile agreements that could be broken. This idea provided an intellectual foundation for resistance. It suggested that the edicts of an emperor were not cosmic laws, but simply the commands of one fallible man, and therefore they could be questioned, ridiculed, or even ignored. The scroll in the hands of these rebel thinkers became a weapon for the powerless. Their writings and public performances fostered a crucial dialogue about the nature of legitimate rule. They forced societies to confront an unsettling possibility that the emperor, for all his finery and armies, might not be wearing any clothes. This tradition of dissent proved that philosophy was not just a tool for building thrones, but also a lever that could, in time, begin to pry them loose. Yet the philosophical halls of power echo with a profound and deliberate silence. Where are the female voices in this grand conversation about statecraft? The historical record, meticulously curated by generations of male scribes, presents a world of political thought dominated by figures like Plato, Aristotle, and Cortelyia. But to accept this narrative at face value is to miss a deeper, more complex truth. The rules of power were almost certainly shaped by a wider range of minds than the official archives would have us believe. Consider Hypatia of Alexandria, a figure who transcends simple categorization. While celebrated today as a mathematician and astronomer, she was, in her own time, a powerful public intellectual operating at the bloody crossroads of philosophy, religion, and politics. In a city seething with sectarian conflict, her Neoplatonic school was a beacon of reasoned inquiry. She moved freely in the highest circles of Roman authority, and her counsel was sought by Orestes, the imperial prefect of Egypt. Her influence was so significant that it made her a target, leading to her brutal murder by a Christian mob. Hypatia was not a queen issuing decrees, but her role as an advisor placed her squarely within the tradition of the philosopher shaping the actions of the powerful. Her story, though exceptional in its visibility, points to a more common reality, that women often exercised philosophical influence from the shadows of the throne. Across cultures, the queen mother, the royal consort, or the abbess of a powerful religious institution frequently served as a trusted confidante and strategist. Their advice on statecraft, diplomacy, and governance, offered in private chambers rather than public forums, would have been instrumental, yet it was rarely recorded for posterity. Their contributions were systematically obscured, not because they were absent, but because the mechanisms of historical preservation were controlled by institutions that had little interest in celebrating female intellect. To ask if there were female philosophers of power is to challenge the very definition of philosophy itself. It pushes us to look beyond the formal treatise and recognize the intellectual labor embedded in the private council that steered empires, the diplomatic wisdom that prevented wars, and the administrative skill that managed vast households, which were themselves microcosms of the state. The scroll may have been held by a king, but the hand that guided its meaning might well have been a woman's. The grandest philosophical idea was utterly powerless if it could not travel. Its reach was measured in the physical weight of papyrus, the endurance of ink, and the calloused hands of the scribe. This was the hidden infrastructure of influence, a world where the cost of a blank scroll and the safety of a trade route could dictate which ideas shaped an empire and which molded in obscurity. The philosophy of power first had to conquer the problem of its own distribution. In an age before the printing press, every copy was a handmade artifact, the product of a slow, painstaking process. A single work by Aristotle or a commentary on Confucius required weeks of labor by a trained scribe, hunched over a sheet of papyrus or parchment, carefully tracing each character. This made texts expensive, rare, and vulnerable. A library fire could erase centuries of thought in an afternoon. The very act of copying a text was an act of interpretation, where a tired scribe might introduce a subtle error that could change the meaning of a law or a moral principle for generations. The spread of ideas was not a given. It was a logistical battle fought with reed pens and ink pots. The ruling powers who understood this held a significant advantage. By controlling the production of writing materials, particularly the papyrus marshes of Egypt, which held a near monopoly for centuries, a state could effectively regulate the flow of information. They could prioritize the copying of texts that reinforced their authority while allowing dissenting works to languish, their single fragile copy eventually crumbling to dust. The technology of writing was not a neutral backdrop. It was an active participant in the struggle for ideological control. Then came a quiet revolution in format, a change as significant as the shift from scroll to screen. The ancient world primarily used the scroll, a long, continuous roll that was unwound horizontally as one read. It was elegant but cumbersome, difficult to reference quickly, and could be easily damaged. Sometime around the 1st century, a new form emerged, the Codex. Essentially, it was a stack of pages bound along one edge, what we would recognize as a book. This was not merely a new style, it was a profound technological leap. The Codex was far more durable than a scroll. Its protective covers shielded the pages from wear and tear. It was immensely portable, allowing a traveler to carry multiple works in a single satchel. Most importantly, it made information accessible. One could flip to a specific page to check a reference or a law code without unrolling a lengthy and fragile document. This portability and durability democratized knowledge. Philosophical and political texts could now travel more safely with merchants, diplomats, and missionaries, slipping across borders with greater ease. The Codex accelerated the cross-pollination of ideas, allowing a Stoic text from Rome to be studied alongside a Buddhist sutra from India in a way that was far more practical with a pile of scrolls. The influence of a political philosophy, therefore, was not just a matter of its intellectual brilliance. It was equally dependent on the resilience of the animal skin it was written on, the efficiency of the shipping routes that carried it, and the simple, revolutionary genius of binding pages together. The throne of ideas was built, quite literally, on a foundation of papyrus, parchment, and glue. The brittle scrolls that survived the collapse of empires carried their ideas into a new world of monasteries and kingdoms. While the Roman legions faded into memory, the philosophical frameworks they once operated on found refuge in the quiet scriptoria of medieval monks. These scribes, often working by candlelight, became the unsung guardians of political thought, meticulously copying not just religious texts but the works of Aristotle, Plato, and Cicero. The ideas within were not dead letters, they were seeds waiting for the right conditions to sprout again. Centuries later, in the bustling universities of Paris and Bologna, an intellectual revolution was brewing, scholasticism. And its fuel was the rediscovery of Aristotle's works, particularly his Politics, which had been preserved and expanded upon by Islamic scholars in the intervening centuries. The scholastic thinkers, most famously Thomas Aquinas, performed a monumental act of synthesis. They fused Aristotle's pragmatic belief in a rational political order with Christian theology, creating the powerful concept of natural law. This was the idea that certain moral and legal principles are inherent in the very nature of humanity, discernible through reason, and therefore binding on all people, even kings. A ruler's authority, in this view, was legitimate only if it conformed to this higher, universal law. It was a philosophical bomb waiting to detonate, placing a limit on royal power that would echo through the Magna Carta and into modern constitutions. Far to the east, a similar transmission was taking place. The collapse of the Tang dynasty in China did not spell the end of Confucian influence. Instead, it spread across the sea. In Korea and Japan, ruling elites actively imported the entire Confucian bureaucratic model, seeing it as the key to building a sophisticated, centralized state. They adopted the civil service examination system, ensuring that their officials were steeped in the same virtues of benevolence, righteousness, and hierarchical order. The royal court in Kyoto or Seoul became a mirror of the Chinese imperial system, not through conquest, but through a deliberate choice to adopt a philosophy of governance that promised stability and longevity. This was not a simple copy, but a careful adaptation, weaving Confucian principles with local Shinto or Buddhist traditions to create a unique and enduring political culture. The philosopher's blueprint, drafted centuries earlier, was proving its versatility, providing a ready-made operating system for kingdoms on the periphery of the Chinese world. Then came the Renaissance, a period defined by its conscious look backward. Scholars scoured monastic libraries for forgotten classical texts, and what they found was a treasure trove of political wisdom that seemed directly relevant to their own time of rising city-states and powerful new monarchs. The humanists, figures like Leonardo Bruni and Niccolò Machiavelli, devoured the histories of Livy and the orations of Cicero. They saw in the Roman Republic a model of civic virtue and eloquent leadership, and in the Roman Empire, lessons on the concentration of power. Machiavelli's The Prince, often misunderstood as a break from tradition, was in fact a deep engagement with the same classical questions of power, stability, and realism that had preoccupied thinkers from Aristotle to Cortelyia. He was simply stripping away the idealistic veneer to examine the mechanics of rule with a cold, analytical eye that his ancient predecessors would have recognized. The Renaissance was not a rejection of the medieval world so much as a rediscovery of an older, parallel stream of thought, proving that the rules written in antiquity possessed a timeless relevance, waiting patiently in their vaults for a new generation to learn from them. The Arthashastra reads like the technical schematic for a machine designed to govern with cold, unblinking efficiency. Its author, Cortelyia, was the shadow architect behind the Mauryan Empire, one of the first to unify the Indian subcontinent. He understood that a king's power was not a mystical force but a system, one that could be engineered, optimized, and defended. The text is staggering in its scope, a sprawling guide that moves seamlessly from the highest principles of statecraft down to the most granular details of administration. It covers the duties of a king, the structure of his court, the management of the treasury, the laws of the land, the conduct of foreign policy, and the intricate arts of espionage. This is not a book of ideals, it is an operating manual for total control. Cortelylia's fundamental premise is that the state is an organic entity with 7 distinct limbs, like the parts of a body. The king is the head, but he is supported by his ministers, his territory, his fortified cities, his treasury, his army, and his allies. For the organism to thrive, each limb must be strong and function in perfect coordination with the others. Any weakness in one part threatens the whole system. This philosophical framework then dictates every practical action. A leaky treasury, for instance, is not just a financial problem, it is a fatal disease that will paralyze the army and invite invasion. Therefore, the Arthashastra devotes immense attention to economics, detailing precise tax rates, methods for fostering agriculture and trade, and strategies for filling the state's coffers. Cortelyia saw wealth not as an end in itself, but as the fuel that powers every other function of the state. But the text's most famous and chilling innovations lie in its treatment of internal security. Cortelyia operates on a brutally realistic view of human nature. He assumes that ministers, princes, and subjects are all potentially disloyal, driven by ambition and fear. To manage this constant threat, the king must become the master of a vast, invisible web of surveillance. The Arthashastra describes in meticulous detail how to recruit and manage spies from every walk of life. They should be deployed as wandering holy men, merchants, servants, even courtesans, all feeding information back to the king. He advises testing the loyalty of one's own sons by having agents tempt them with promises of power. This is a philosophy of power stripped of all sentiment. The king's ultimate duty is the preservation and expansion of the state, and any action taken toward that end, no matter how ruthless, is justified. The goal is stability through absolute, omniscient control. Yet, even within this cold calculus, there is a profound philosophical purpose. Cortelia argues that this harsh system is necessary to create a larger condition of order, or danda, which protects the weak from the strong and allows society to function without descending into chaos. The Arthashastra represents the ultimate logical conclusion of a certain kind of political thought, where the philosopher's reason is applied not to envision a perfect society, but to build an unbreakable one. Cicero watched the Roman Republic tear itself apart, and he reached for a philosopher's pen, not a soldier's sword. In his final years, as political violence became the norm and the old institutions crumbled, he composed two monumental dialogues on the Republic and on the laws. These were not abstract academic exercises. They were a desperate attempt to codify the soul of a dying state, to synthesize the brilliant political theories of Plato and Aristotle with the practical, centuries-old traditions of Rome. His central argument was for a balanced constitution, a mixed government that blended the authority of a monarch represented by the consuls, the wisdom of an aristocracy found in the Senate, and the voice of the people expressed through the assemblies. He saw this delicate equilibrium as the only safeguard against the tyranny of a single man or the chaos of the mob. But Cicero added a crucial element to this Greek framework, a uniquely Roman ideal, the statesman-orator. For him, the true leader was not just a wise philosopher-king, but a master of eloquence. This leader's duty was to use reasoned, persuasive speech to guide public opinion, to forge consensus, and to defend the Republic's laws and traditions against demagogues and would-be dictators. He believed that wisdom without the ability to communicate it effectively was powerless in the public forum. Cicero himself was the living embodiment of this ideal, a self-made man who rose to the highest office, the consulship, through his unparalleled skill in rhetoric. He tried to wield his eloquence like a shield, delivering fiery speeches against the conspirator Catiline to preserve the state. Yet, in the end, his words were not enough. The armies of Caesar, Pompey, and later Antony proved stronger than any speech. Cicero was hunted down and killed, his head and hands nailed to the rostrum, the very platform from which he had spoken so powerfully. His philosophy failed to save the Republic in its moment of crisis, but his writings survived. They were preserved by monks, studied by scholars, and when Europe's Enlightenment thinkers looked for a model of republican virtue and balanced government, they rediscovered Cicero. His ideas on natural law, civic duty, and the mixed constitution became the intellectual bedrock for the founders of modern republics. His tragic life and his brilliant books together illustrate a profound truth, that a philosopher's response to a specific political collapse can provide a timeless blueprint, a set of rules for power that would only find their true audience centuries later. Their profound influence makes their obscurity all the more puzzling. If these philosophers drafted the very rules of power, why are their names not as familiar as the emperors they served? The fading of their scrolls was not an accident, but the result of powerful historical currents that actively erased them. The most dramatic cause was the physical annihilation of knowledge. The great libraries, those repositories of philosophical power, were incredibly vulnerable. The Library of Alexandria, that legendary center of learning, suffered a slow decline through a series of fires and political neglect, its vast collection of scrolls gradually turning to ash and dust. Each blaze was a catastrophe, wiping out entire schools of thought in a single night. But destruction was not always so spectacular. The most effective erasure was far quieter, the slow, deliberate censorship by new regimes. A conquering dynasty, especially one bringing a new state religion, had little interest in preserving philosophies that justified the previous ruler's authority. The works of thinkers loyal to the old order would be systematically purged from official records, their scrolls left to rot in forgotten storerooms or scraped clean so the parchment could be reused. Their ideas were deemed dangerous, a threat to the new narrative of power, and so they were silenced. Yet, perhaps the most common reason for their anonymity was their own success. The most brilliant philosophical frameworks were not meant to be celebrated, they were meant to be operational. When a concept like bureaucratic meritocracy or the rule of law becomes so deeply embedded in the daily functioning of a government, it ceases to be seen as a revolutionary idea from a specific person. It just becomes the way things are. We do not think about the architect of a bridge every time we cross it, we simply trust its structure. In the same way, the anonymous officials who perfected tax collection or standardized legal codes built the infrastructure of civilization itself. Their genius was in making their systems so efficient, so seamless, that they became invisible. The true legacy of these forgotten philosophers is not a famous name in a history book, but the enduring shape of our world, the silent, powerful structures that continue to govern our lives without our ever knowing who first drew the plans. That silent infrastructure of power, built on papyrus and parchment, now operates on silicon and light. The scroll has become a data stream, but the fundamental questions of governance remain unchanged. The forgotten philosophers who advised emperors would instantly recognize the core challenges of our digital age. They understood that power, whether held by a king or a corporation, ultimately rests on the same fragile pillars of legitimacy, organization, and narrative. The journey from a royal court to a modern Capitol building is not as long as it seems. Consider the timeless need for ethical leadership. Marcus Aurelius, scribbling his Stoic meditations by candlelight, was grappling with the same corrupting influence of absolute authority that any modern leader faces. His struggle to remain just, prudent, and self-controlled in the face of immense power is a direct parallel to the ethical dilemmas in today's boardrooms and governments. The pressure to prioritize short-term gain over long-term stability, to bend rules for convenience, or to succumb to the flattery of subordinates is a human constant. The ancient advice to lead with virtue and reason is not a quaint historical relic. It is a necessary operating manual for anyone who wields influence today. The philosopher's emphasis on systemic thinking is even more critical now. Aristotle's analysis of how a stable middle class underpins political harmony finds a direct echo in modern economic policy debates. Cortelia's intricate blueprint for a state as an interconnected organism, where a weak treasury threatens the entire army, is a precursor to our complex models of global finance and supply chains. We are still trying to build resilient systems, just on a scale those ancient thinkers could scarcely imagine. Their fundamental insight that stability requires balancing multiple forces and anticipating cascading failures is the very essence of modern risk management and strategic planning. And what of the power of persuasion? The ancient rhetorician's toolkit of logos, pathos, and ethos is the foundation of every modern political campaign, marketing strategy, and social media influencers' playbook. Cicero's belief that eloquence was essential for building consensus and defending the state is proven daily in our 24-hour news cycles and online forums. The medium has changed from the public square to the smartphone screen, but the psychological principles of how to persuade, motivate, and unite a population are precisely the same. We are all, in a sense, living in the vast global agora the Greeks envisioned. Most urgently, the ancient warnings about unchecked power resonate with a chilling clarity. The legalist embrace of control through surveillance, detailed so coldly in the Arthashastra, raises profound questions in our era of mass data collection and algorithmic governance. The tension the philosophers identified between security and freedom, between efficiency and humanity, is at the heart of our debates about privacy and artificial intelligence. We are grappling with the same dilemma, just with vastly more powerful tools. These parallels suggest that the journey from scroll to throne was never really about the past. It was about defining the enduring rules of how humans organize, lead, and persuade one another. By understanding how these ideas were forged in the fires of ancient empires, we gain a priceless lens through which to examine our own world. The throne may now be a CEO's chair or a president's desk, but the need for wisdom, foresight, and a moral compass is as vital as ever. The true architects of power were never the figures on the coins, but the minds behind the manuscripts. Our journey from the quiet scriptorium to the gleaming throne reveals that the grand narratives of kings and emperors were often directed by the profound and frequently forgotten insights of philosophers. These thinkers were the ultimate system architects, drafting the intellectual blueprints that guided empires for centuries. They understood a fundamental truth that brute force alone is a fleeting and fragile foundation for command. Sustainable authority, the kind that builds civilizations that last for 1,000 years, is built on something far more resilient, a framework of powerful ideas. These ideas revolved around creating systems of justice that felt fair, establishing an order that provided stability, engineering administrative efficiency that made life predictable, and most importantly, crafting a sense of legitimacy that made obedience feel like the natural and right course of action. A ruler who merely commands fear will eventually face rebellion, but a ruler who can command consent through a shared belief in the system's righteousness builds a throne that can withstand the shocks of history. As we navigate our own complex world of digital empires and global power structures, we would do well to remember these intellectual pioneers. The challenges of legitimacy, the corrupting influence of authority, and the delicate balance between freedom and control are not new dilemmas. They are the very same puzzles that occupied the minds of thinkers from Aristotle to Cortelyia. Their forgotten scrolls offer a timeless lens through which to examine the mechanics of power in our own time, reminding us that the most enduring thrones are built not on stone but on thought. If this exploration into the hidden rules of ancient power resonated with you, we would be grateful if you liked this video and subscribed for more journeys into historical mysteries. And we are genuinely curious, which of these forgotten philosophers do you find most compelling? Share your thoughts in the comments below.